He came to close a business, but instead he discovered the one person who could save it, and the devastating reason no one else knew his name. If you believe real talent deserves to be seen, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that matter, and let us know in the comments section where you are watching from. What he found at 3 a.m. will change everything. Alexis Manz had a rule: never visit a property after midnight unless you were ready to see it die. But standing in the employee parking lot of Underdog at 2:47 a.m., his Italian leather shoes crunching on gravel that hadn't been swept in weeks, he wasn't here to save anything. He was here to confirm what the spreadsheets already told him. This flagship restaurant, the one he'd poured 7 figures into 3 years ago, was bleeding money, and tomorrow morning, he'd sign the liquidation papers. He adjusted the collar of his coat, expensive cashmere that cost more than most of his staff made in a month. He'd dressed down for this. No tie, no briefcase, nothing that screamed owner. Just a man who could blend into shadows, which was exactly what he needed to do. The building looked tired in the darkness. A few exterior lights flickered weakly, casting uneven pools of yellow across the brick facade. One of the neon letters in the sign had burned out weeks ago, no one had bothered to replace it. That told him everything. When people stopped caring about the details, the end was already written. He pulled out his phone, checked the time. 3 minutes to 3. The night manager should have locked up 2 hours ago. The kitchen should be cold, dark, empty. But Alexis hadn't built an empire by trusting what should be. He'd built it by showing up when no one expected him. He moved toward the back entrance, the employee door that opened into the kitchen. His hand hovered over the handle. For just a moment, barely a breath, he hesitated. This was the part he hated. The final walkthrough before a closure. The moment when a business became just another line item in a portfolio, when people became unemployment statistics. He exhaled slowly, a thin stream of vapor in the cold night air. "All right," he whispered to no one. "Let's see what's left." The door opened with a low creak that seemed too loud in the silence. He stepped inside. The kitchen still held the ghost of the evening service. Not the bright, frantic energy of a dinner rush, but something softer. The air carried layers, charred rosemary, rendered butter, something sweet and caramelized that lingered like a memory. The overhead fluorescents were off. Only the red glow of the digital clock above the expo station cast any light, its numbers bleeding across the stainless steel like a wound. 3 a.m. The liquidation papers sat in Alexis Manz's briefcase like a loaded gun. He'd reviewed them 3 times already, once with his lawyers in their marble-floored conference room, once with his accountant who'd laid out the numbers with surgical precision, and once alone in his penthouse at midnight when the city below had finally gone quiet and there was nothing left but him and the truth. The truth was brutal. Underdog had hemorrhaged $2 million over 18 months. Staff turnover had hit 47%, nearly half his workforce had quit or been fired in less than 2 years. Customer reviews on Yelp had dropped from 4.5 stars to 3.2. The last health inspection had uncovered violations that made his stomach turn: improper food storage, inadequate temperature controls, evidence of pest activity in the dry storage area. The kind of violations that ended careers and closed restaurants permanently. Efficiency or exit. That was his mantra. The philosophy that had built his empire. The line that had made Bloomberg call him the butcher of Restaurant Row in their profile last year. His investors loved it. His board of directors quoted it in meetings. Cut the dead weight. Pivot fast. Never let sentiment cloud judgment. Never hold on to a sinking ship just because you once believed in the voyage. It was the reason he controlled a restaurant portfolio worth $300 million at 39 years old. The reason venture capitalists called him first when they needed someone to turn around a failing concept. The reason he could afford a penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, a garage full of cars he barely drove, and a reputation for ruthlessness that preceded him into every room. But tonight, sitting in the back of his Mercedes outside Ember and Oak at 2:47 in the morning, Alexis felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Something uncomfortable and unfamiliar that sat in his chest like a stone. Doubt. This restaurant was supposed to be different. 3 years ago, when he'd signed the acquisition papers in a conference room that smelled like leather and ambition, he'd actually believed in it. Not just as an investment, not just as another line item in his portfolio, but as something that mattered. The location was prime real estate in a gentrifying neighborhood. The concept was solid, farm-to-table contemporary American with a focus on local sourcing and seasonal menus. He'd hired a James Beard-nominated chef who'd worked at 3 Michelin-star restaurants in New York. He'd invested 7 figures in renovations, new kitchen equipment, designer furniture, a custom lighting system that made the space feel like art. He'd done everything right. And it had failed anyway. His phone buzzed in his hand, pulling him back to the present. A text from his CFO, Mitchell, who apparently never slept. Papers ready for 9 a.m. signature. Board wants this closed by end of month. Clean exit. No complications. Clean exit. Such sterile language for destroying 63 livelihoods. 63 people who would wake up in a few weeks to find their jobs eliminated, their health insurance cancelled, their paychecks suddenly stopped. Most of them had families. Most of them were living paycheck to paycheck in a city that got more expensive every year. Most of them would struggle to find new positions in a saturated market where everyone was hiring but no one was paying livable wages. Alexis knew these statistics. He'd reviewed the employee files yesterday in his office while his assistant brought him coffee and pretended not to notice the tightness in his jaw. Average age, 32. Average tenure, 14 months. Average salary, $32,000 a year. Barely enough to survive, let alone thrive. Tomorrow morning at 9, he'd meet with his lawyers in their conference room with its view of the skyline. By noon, the papers would be signed. By the end of the month, this building would be gutted, rebranded, or demolished. The staff would get their severance. He wasn't cruel, he told himself, but they'd also get their walking papers. And he'd move on to the next acquisition, the next turnaround, the next success story that would help him forget this failure. That's just business, he told himself. That's survival in an industry where 90% of restaurants fail within 5 years. That's the reality of capitalism in America in 2024. But something had drawn him here tonight. Maybe it was due diligence, one final check before committing to the decision. Maybe it was masochism, some perverse need to walk through the corpse of his failure one last time. Or maybe, buried beneath years of spreadsheets and investor calls and board meetings where humans became numbers, some small part of him still remembered why he'd fallen in love with restaurants in the first place. Back before they became assets. Before they became line items. Before they became things to be optimized or eliminated. He remembered being 19 years old, working as a dishwasher in an Italian restaurant in Brooklyn. 16-hour shifts for $8 an hour, his hands raw from industrial soap, his back aching from lifting bus tubs filled with dirty plates. But there was something about the energy of a kitchen in full service that had hooked him. The organized chaos. The perfect timing. The way a team of strangers could coordinate like a single organism, producing hundreds of meals in a night, each one a small act of creation. That was 20 years ago. He'd worked his way up, dishwasher to prep cook to line cook to sous chef to head chef to restaurant manager to owner to investor. And somewhere along that journey, he'd forgotten why any of it mattered beyond the profit margins. Alexis pocketed his phone and stared at the building. One of the exterior lights flickered and died as he watched, leaving that section of the facade in complete darkness. Even the infrastructure was giving up. Tomorrow morning, he'd sign those papers with a clear conscience and move on. But first, he needed to see it one last time. To confirm there was nothing here worth saving. To silence that small, irrational voice that whispered, "What if you're missing something?" He opened the car door and stepped out into the cold night air. The door was unlocked. That was the first red flag. The first sign of how far things had fallen when a restaurant in this neighborhood left its back entrance unsecured at 3 in the morning. Alexis pushed it open and stepped inside. And that's when he heard the sound that would change everything. Thwack. 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 The kitchen breathed in the darkness like a sleeping beast, alive but dormant. Alexis stood frozen just inside the doorway, his hands still on the handle behind him, his heart rate spiking in a way that annoyed him. He was 40 years old, for God's sake. A man who'd negotiated million-dollar deals without breaking a sweat. A man who'd fired executives and closed businesses and made decisions that affected hundreds of lives without losing sleep. But something about this moment, the emptiness, the red glow of that clock reading 3 a.m., the persistent sound of a knife hitting a cutting board, made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. No one should be here. He'd checked the schedules himself yesterday. The night manager's log showed the building had been secured and locked at 11:47 p.m. Security didn't patrol until 6 a.m. The nearest employee on record didn't clock in until 7:30 a.m. Whatever was happening in his kitchen right now was completely unauthorized. Thwack. 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 The rhythm was hypnotic. Steady as a metronome, precise as a heartbeat. Not the frantic chopping of someone rushing through prep work trying to beat a clock. Not the sloppy hacking of an amateur who didn't know proper knife technique. This was controlled. Masterful. The sound of someone who'd spent years, maybe decades, perfecting a single motion until it became as natural as breathing. Alexis let the door close behind him with a soft click and moved deeper into the space. His expensive shoes, handmade Italian leather that cost more than most people's rent, were soft enough to keep him silent on the tile floor. He'd learned a long time ago that you saw the truth when people didn't know they were being watched. The main kitchen was a graveyard of the evening service. Prep tables had been wiped down but not spotless. He noted a smear of what looked like tomato sauce near the edge of one, dried and brown. Cutting boards were stacked against the wall at careless angles instead of properly stored. A forgotten container of minced garlic sat uncovered near the burners, which violated every food safety protocol in existence. 3 dirty towels were draped over the edge of a sink. A prep sheet had been left on the expo line, covered in illegible handwriting and grease stains. Signs of a rushed close. Signs of a staff that didn't care anymore or was too exhausted to care. Signs of the slow decay that had been eating away at this restaurant for months while he'd been too busy reviewing numbers to actually look. But that sound. That persistent, perfect rhythm coming from somewhere deeper in the building. Thwack. 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 He passed the dish station where a few plates sat drying in the rack. The chemical smell of industrial sanitizer still lingered in the air. The spice shelves that desperately needed reorganizing. He could see containers with their labels facing the wrong way, some nearly empty, others expired based on the dates visible. The walk-in cooler humming its mechanical lullaby, probably burning electricity inefficiently because no one had maintained it properly. Each step brought him closer to the source of that sound. Each step made his curiosity burn hotter, overriding his corporate instincts that screamed at him to call security, to handle this the proper way, to document everything for liability purposes. Thwack. 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 A thin line of light spilled from beneath the prep room door in the back corner. The door that should have been closed and locked. The room that was only supposed to be accessed during regular business hours with proper supervision. Alexis approached it slowly, his hand reaching for his phone in his pocket. The smart move was to call someone. Security. The police. His lawyers. The smart move was to let other people handle whatever situation was unfolding in his kitchen at 3 in the morning. But something held him back. Something about that rhythm, about the precision and care it represented, made him want to see what kind of person worked with such dedication when they thought no one was watching. He reached for the door handle, then paused. This was it. The moment where he could still turn around. Where he could make the safe choice. The corporate choice. The choice that protected him from liability and kept everything clean and documented. Instead, Alexis eased the door open just a few inches and looked inside. What he saw made every assumption he'd ever made about talent, about credentials, about worth and value and what it meant to be skilled. All of it began to crumble like a house built on sand. Under a single pendant light that hung low from the ceiling, casting a perfect circle of illumination in the otherwise dark prep room, Ryan Matthew worked like a man possessed by something holy. His chef's coat was impossibly white despite what must have been hours of work, crisp and clean like he'd just put it on. His movements were so fluid, so economical, so perfectly calibrated that they seemed almost choreographed. The knife in his hand, Alexis recognized it immediately as a 10-inch Wusthof classic, probably $400 retail, from the high-end supplier catalog he'd approved purchases from, flashed in the light like liquid silver. It moved through a pile of carrots with speed that shouldn't have been possible, reducing them to perfect brunoise cubes in seconds. Each cube no larger than a match head. Each one identical to the last. Falling in a perfect pile like bright orange gems. Alexis had hired 3 celebrity chefs over the past 2 years. He'd paid them 6-figure salaries, the last one had demanded $180,000 plus bonuses. He'd sat through their pitch meetings where they presented mood boards and concept papers. He'd watched their television appearances on cooking shows. He'd eaten their signature dishes at their previous restaurants. He'd read their cookbooks with their glossy photos and testimonials from food critics. Not one of them had moved like this. Ryan's technique was flawless in a way that made Alexis forget to breathe. The knife never left the cutting board, just rocked in that perfect professional chef's motion, tipped down as the pivot point, blade rising and falling in a blur of steel and precision. His left hand, the guide hand, held the vegetables in the claw grip, knuckles forward, fingers curled back safely away from the blade. His right hand controlled the knife with the kind of relaxed confidence that only came from thousands of hours of practice. No wasted movement. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just pure, concentrated skill that came from somewhere deep and earned through years of repetition in the trenches. Alexis pushed the door open wider, transfixed. He knew he should announce himself. Should ask what the hell Ryan was doing here at this hour. Should be thinking about liability insurance and workers' compensation claims and the 100 corporate policies this violated. But he couldn't move. Couldn't speak. Could only watch this unexpected performance unfolding in the red-tinged darkness. Ryan's shoulders were coiled tight, tense like a spring ready to release, carrying tension that spoke of stress and pressure and worry. But his hands were loose, relaxed, dancing across the cutting board with the confidence of a concert pianist performing a piece they'd played 1,000 times. The contrast was striking, a body preparing for battle while hands created art. Sweat beaded at Ryan's temple despite the cool temperature of the kitchen. His breathing was controlled, rhythmic, matching the pace of his cuts perfectly. In through the nose for 3 cuts. Out through the mouth for 3 cuts. A meditation in motion. Next to the cutting board sat containers of prep work that looked like they belonged in a Michelin-starred kitchen, not a failing neighborhood restaurant. Julienne vegetables, carrots, celery, bell peppers, each piece identical in width and length, cut with such precision they could have been done by a machine. A reduction sauce cooling in a small copper pot, its surface glossy and perfect, catching the light like dark honey. Fresh herbs minced so fine they looked like green powder, releasing their aromatic oils into the air. Onions diced so uniformly they could have been measured with calipers. Everything was organized with military precision. Each container labeled not just with the ingredient name but with detailed information, preparation date, expiration time, temperature requirements, intended use. The handwriting was neat, careful, showing attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. This wasn't prep work. This was artistry. This was craftsmanship. This was someone who cared about their work in a way that transcended paychecks and job titles. Alexis's eyes moved to Ryan's hands and saw the story written there in scar tissue and burns. Across the knuckles of his right hand, burns in various stages of healing, some fresh and angry pink, others old and silvered with time. A thick scar ran along the inside of his left thumb, the kind of scar that came from a serious kitchen accident, probably requiring stitches. The tips of his fingers were calloused and rough from constant contact with hot metal and sharp edges. More burns on his forearms, visible below the rolled-up sleeves of his chef's coat. Cross-hatched patterns that came from pulling sheet pans out of ovens, from handling hot pots, from years of working in confined spaces where burns were inevitable and accepted as the cost of the craft. These weren't the soft, unblemished hands of someone fresh out of culinary school. These weren't the hands of someone who'd learned to cook from YouTube videos and recipe blogs. These were the hands of a soldier. Of someone who'd earned every skill the hard way, in the trenches, during the kind of shifts that broke weaker people. The personnel file flashed through Alexis's memory with sudden, uncomfortable clarity. Ryan Matthew. 26 years old. Current position, prep cook. Salary, $15.50 per hour, barely above minimum wage. No formal culinary training listed. No college degree. No certifications from culinary schools. No impressive previous employers. Just a single reference from someone named Marcus Williams that Alexis had never heard of, and 8 months of evening prep cook as his entire resume. Whoever had processed that hiring paperwork had buried a diamond in the basement and walked away without bothering to look at what they'd found. Ryan reached for a bell pepper, and Alexis noticed something else. The way he examined it first before cutting. Turning it in his hand, feeling for firmness, checking the color and the stem, looking for any blemishes or soft spots. Quality control built into every gesture. This man cared about his ingredients the way a jeweler cared about their gems, the way a painter cared about their pigments. He set the pepper down and made his first cut with the kind of confidence that came from understanding the structure of vegetables at an instinctive level. The blade went exactly where it needed to go, following the natural lines of the pepper, minimizing waste, maximizing yield. Within seconds, the pepper had been transformed into perfect strips, then perfect dice, all uniform in size. Alexis stood there in the doorway, watching this unexpected masterclass in knife skills, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not excitement about profit margins or successful acquisitions. Not satisfaction from closing a deal or maximizing efficiency. Wonder. Pure, simple wonder at watching someone do something they were genuinely, exceptionally good at. He took a breath and stepped fully into the prep room. "You're here late." Ryan's knife stopped mid-air like someone had hit a pause button on reality. For 3 seconds, maybe 4, he didn't move at all. Didn't breathe. Didn't blink. Just stood there frozen with the blade hovering above the cutting board, his entire body rigid with the kind of tension that came from being caught doing something you weren't supposed to be doing. Then, slowly, so slowly it was almost painful to watch, he set the knife down with deliberate care. The blade settled onto the cutting board with a soft click that seemed too loud in the sudden silence. He wiped his hands on his apron, taking his time, clearly using those extra seconds to compose himself and decide how to handle this situation. When he finally turned around, Alexis was struck by his eyes. Not tired, not defensive, but alert and watchful in a way that spoke of experience with dangerous situations. The kind of eyes that had learned to read a room before speaking. The kind of eyes that had survived moments where saying the wrong thing could cost everything. "Didn't mean to disturb you," Ryan said. His voice was low, controlled, each word carefully measured before being released into the air. "Just finishing some prep." Alexis kept his expression neutral, his hands in his coat pockets, trying to project casual curiosity rather than the absolute shock currently rewiring his brain. "At 3 in the morning? I don't like leaving too much for the morning crew." The response came too quick, too rehearsed. A line Ryan had probably used before when questioned about his hours. A line that was technically true but hid more than it revealed. "You do this often?" Alexis asked, his voice deliberately casual. "Come in when no one's watching?" "Sometimes." Just that one word, delivered flat, giving nothing away. "Sometimes," Alexis repeated slowly, his eyes now taking in the full scope of the prep room with new attention. This wasn't just random vegetables being chopped for tomorrow's service. This was organized. Systematic. Intentional. The containers lined up on the shelf weren't labeled with just ingredient names, they had dates, temperatures, cooking times, plating instructions. Recipe notes scribbled in the margins. Cost calculations written at the bottom. This was menu development. Professional-grade menu development. The kind of work that executive chefs did, not minimum-wage prep cooks. "How long have you been here today?" Alexis asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer would be disturbing. Ryan picked up a towel, wiped his hands slowly, buying time to decide how much truth to tell. "Came in around noon. 15 hours. The math hit Alexis like a bucket of cold water. This man had been working for 15 hours straight, and he was still standing here at 3 in the morning with the precision and focus and attention to detail of someone just starting their shift. Still moving with perfect technique. Still maintaining standards that would make a 3-star chef jealous. "That's a long shift," Alexis said, keeping his voice even. "It's fine." Defensive now, walls going up. "Doesn't look fine." Ryan's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his ear. "I'm good." "Really?" But then something shifted. Ryan's attention drifted away from Alexis, pulled by something more powerful than the concern of a stranger. His eyes moved to something taped to the inside of the metal shelf above his workstation, a photograph, small and worn at the edges from being touched repeatedly. The photo showed an older black man in a chef's coat, probably in his 60s, his arm wrapped around a younger version of Ryan. Maybe Ryan at 19 or 20, before the burns and scars, before the weight of responsibility had settled into his shoulders. Both of them were smiling genuine smiles, the kind that came from real joy rather than posed obligation. They were standing in a kitchen, and behind them Alexis could see what looked like a small restaurant, nothing fancy, just honest and real. Ryan's entire expression softened in a way that made Alexis's chest tighten uncomfortably. The defensive walls came down. The careful mask slipped. And for just a moment, Alexis saw the real person beneath all the practiced responses. "Chef Marcus used to say the best menus are written at midnight," Ryan murmured, speaking to the photograph more than to Alexis. His voice had dropped lower, gotten rougher around the edges, weighted with emotion he was trying to control. "When the world's quiet enough to hear what the ingredients are trying to tell you." He reached for a small notebook that sat on the shelf next to the photograph. The cover was stained with what looked like olive oil and tomato sauce, the corners bent and worn from being carried in pockets and handled with ingredient-covered hands. Its pages bulged, thick with notes and additions and the accumulated knowledge of months of work. He taught me everything, Ryan continued, still talking more to the photo than to the stranger in the doorway. How to taste a dish before you even cook it. How to balance acid and fat without measuring, just by instinct. How to make food that tells a story instead of just filling a plate. How to respect ingredients. How to understand that cooking isn't just about following recipes, it's about understanding why the recipe works, what each ingredient contributes, how to adjust and adapt and improvise. Ryan's voice dropped even lower, rougher, like he was speaking around something stuck in his throat. He died 18 months ago. Heart attack in the middle of service. Didn't even make it to the hospital. 1 minute he was working the line, calling out orders, doing what he loved. The next minute he was on the floor and nothing anyone did could bring him back. The air in the prep room felt suddenly too thick, too heavy. Alexis wanted to say something, anything that might acknowledge the weight of that loss, but the words stuck in his throat. What could he possibly say that wouldn't sound hollow and corporate and meaningless? His family. Ryan's fingers traced the edge of the notebook, a gesture that looked automatic, something he'd done 1,000 times. His wife had been working retail for 30 years, barely making enough to get by. His daughter was a sophomore at Ohio State, full tuition, trying to be the first person in their family to get a degree. When he died, they had nothing. Hospital bills from the ambulance and the ER. Funeral costs. His daughter's tuition for the next semester was due. Insurance didn't cover nearly enough. Ryan looked up then, finally meeting Alexis's eyes directly. So I gave up my scholarship. Johnson and Wales, full ride. I was halfway through my degree, and I walked away. Came home. Got this job. Started sending them every penny I could spare. Worked the night shifts because they paid a little more. Worked the hours nobody else wanted because it meant a few extra dollars that could help keep his daughter in school or help his wife keep the lights on. He paused, and something that might have been a bitter laugh escaped him. And I'm here now, at 3 a.m., working on this menu because I thought maybe, just maybe, if I could create something unique enough, something that made people talk, something that brought customers in and got good reviews, it might turn this place around. Might save everyone's jobs. Might prove that Chef Marcus didn't waste his time teaching a kid who'd never amount to anything. Ryan's voice cracked slightly on the last words, and he looked away, clearly angry at himself for showing emotion to a stranger. You probably think I'm crazy, he muttered. I think, Alexis said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper, you care more about this kitchen than anyone I've ever paid to run it. The silence that followed that statement was heavy with things unsaid. Ryan looked at him for a long moment, trying to figure out who this stranger was and why he was here and what he really wanted. Alexis cleared his throat. What's in the notebook? Ryan hesitated, his hand hovering protectively over the notebook like it contained state secrets. For a moment, Alexis thought he might refuse, might tell this stranger to leave him alone and let him finish his work in peace. But then something in Ryan's expression shifted. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe loneliness. Maybe the simple human need to show someone, anyone, that your work matters. Slowly, he picked up the notebook and held it out. Everything I've been working on. The midnight menu. I thought if I could create something unique enough, something that made people actually want to come here instead of just ending up here by default, it might turn things around. Alexis took the notebook carefully, like it might burn him or dissolve if he handled it too roughly. The cover was worn smooth from months of handling, stained with fingerprints in various colors, olive oil, tomato sauce, something dark that might have been reduced balsamic or possibly blood from a kitchen cut. The edges were frayed. A rubber band held it closed. This was a working document, not something clean and precious. He removed the rubber band and opened it to the first page. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. This wasn't a collection of recipes copied from cookbooks or printed from the internet. This was chemistry. Real, actual food science at a level that required serious education and understanding. The first page showed molecular structures of flavor compounds, thiols and aldehydes and esters, with arrows indicating reactions and transformations. Notes on Maillard reactions and the precise temperatures where they occurred most efficiently. Diagrams showing protein denaturation and coagulation. Graphs depicting the relationship between pH and flavor perception. This was graduate-level food science, written in handwriting that suggested late nights and desperate focus and a mind that couldn't stop thinking about problems until they were solved. Alexis flipped to the next page, his hands slightly unsteady. Sketches of plating filled the page, each one more intricate than the last. Not rough ideas but precisely measured diagrams with rulers and angles marked. Component placement calculated to the centimeter. Color theory notes about visual appetite appeal, warm colors in foreground, cool colors in background, height variation to create visual interest. Texture contrasts mapped like musical compositions, annotated with timing notes, crunchy element must be added last, temperature contrast between hot and cold, smooth followed by rough. Every detail of the dining experience thought through and optimized. Another page. Ingredient sourcing notes, written in tiny, cramped handwriting to fit as much information as possible. Local farms contacted with phone numbers and email addresses. Seasonal availability charts showing what would be fresh during which months. Cost projections broken down by ingredient and portion, calculated down to the penny. Profit margin calculations that showed Ryan understood not just cooking but business, food cost percentages, labor cost considerations, pricing strategies that would allow for both quality and profitability. He'd built an entire operational plan for a menu that no one had asked him to create. A menu that he developed on his own time, during his unpaid hours, because he believed in it. Alexis kept flipping, each page revealing another layer of genius. Flavor pairing matrices that would make a professional food lab jealous, lists of ingredients crossed with other ingredients, notes on which combinations worked and why at a molecular level. Research on cultural fusion techniques, with notes on how to honor traditional cooking methods from different cultures while pushing them somewhere new without being disrespectful or appropriative. Wine pairing suggestions with detailed tasting notes. Beer pairings. Even non-alcoholic beverage options designed to complement each dish. Mock reviews written from a customer's perspective, anticipating reactions, first bite, expecting traditional, surprised by the subtle heat. Second bite, understanding the complexity. Third bite, addicted to the contrast. This showed psychological understanding of how people experience food, how anticipation and surprise play into enjoyment. How long have you been working on this? Alexis asked, his voice hoarse. 6 months. Maybe closer to 7. Ryan paused, then added quietly, every night shift. Every moment the kitchen's empty and no one's watching. I know I'm just a prep cook. I know I don't have the credentials or the degree or the fancy resume. But Chef Marcus always said talent doesn't live in a diploma. It lives in the work. In the craft. In what you can actually create. Alexis reached a page that stopped him cold, made his hands freeze mid-motion. A title written in careful block letters, the kind of lettering that took time and intention, the Phoenix menu, rising from the ashes. Below it, a full tasting menu. 7 courses, each one building on the last, each one incorporating techniques that would make any established chef jealous. The progression showed deep understanding of how to structure a dining experience, starting light and bright, building intensity, creating moments of surprise, ending with satisfaction and memory. And at the bottom of the page, in smaller handwriting that looked like it had been added later, almost like an afterthought, for the team. To save our jobs. To prove we're worth keeping. The liquidation papers in Alexis's briefcase suddenly felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. Thought balloon, he's about to make a decision that changes everything. But first, if you're hooked on this story, smash that like button and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. What would you do in his position? Drop a comment below, then keep watching. The sound of the back door slamming open shattered the moment like a brick through a window. The violence of it made both Alexis and Ryan flinch. Their eyes met for a split second, Ryan's filled with sudden fear, Alexis's with surprise, before heavy footsteps echoed through the main kitchen. Loud, angry footsteps moving fast, accompanied by the jangle of keys and the rustle of clothing. "I knew it," a voice shouted, male and familiar in a way that made Alexis's jaw tighten with instant recognition. "I goddamn knew he was stealing from us. I told them he was up to something." Ryan's face went pale, color draining so fast he looked almost gray in the red-tinged light. He moved instinctively to hide the notebook, to shove it back into its hiding spot, but it was too late. His hands fumbled with the pages, and the notebook slipped, falling to the floor where it landed with a slap that seemed absurdly loud. The prep room door burst open with enough force to make it bang against the wall, and Marcus Sullivan, the restaurant's general manager, the man Alexis had hired 2 years ago based on an impressive resume and strong references, stormed in with a security guard close behind him. Sullivan's face was red and blotchy, his eyes wild with the kind of righteous anger that came from finally catching someone you'd been gunning for. His shirt was untucked on one side, his hair messed up, like he'd gotten dressed in a hurry or had been sleeping in his car waiting for this moment. "There he is." Sullivan pointed at Ryan like he'd discovered a serial killer. "Caught red-handed. Trespassing, theft, unauthorized use of company property. Tony, call the police right now." The security guard, an older man named Tony who looked deeply uncomfortable but obedient, the kind of employee who followed orders without question, reached for his radio with a shaking hand. "Wait," Ryan started, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, but Sullivan cut him off before he could finish the thought. "Don't even try it, Matthew." Sullivan's voice hit a fever pitch that was almost inhuman. "I've had my eye on you for months. Working late, using expensive ingredients, acting like you own the place, walking around like you're some kind of chef instead of just prep. I checked the logs. You're not scheduled tonight. This is breaking and entering. This is theft. This is exactly what I told them you'd do." "I have a key," Ryan said quietly, trying to stay calm despite the panic visible in his eyes. "Chef Davis gave me access for prep work. Chef Davis doesn't work here anymore." Sullivan's voice cracked with the volume. "He quit 6 months ago. That key should have been returned. And you're fired too. Effective immediately. Tony, remove this trespasser. I want him arrested for theft and breaking and entering." The security guard moved toward Ryan, reaching for his arm with an apologetic expression that said he was sorry but orders were orders. Ryan didn't resist, didn't fight, didn't argue. He just let his shoulders slump in the defeat of someone who'd always known this moment would come eventually. Who'd been waiting for the other shoe to drop. He'd been invisible for so long, existing in the margins, working in the shadows. And now he was visible for all the wrong reasons. Alexis felt something crack open inside his chest. Something that had been dormant for years, buried under spreadsheets and profit margins and quarterly reports. Something that had been sleeping under the comfortable numbness of efficiency or exit, and the cold calculus of treating people like assets to be optimized or eliminated. He watched Ryan, this brilliant, self-taught chef who'd given up everything to honor his mentor's memory, who'd worked 15-hour days on poverty wages, who'd created a masterpiece no one would ever see, and he realized he was watching the death of everything he'd once believed restaurants could be. The liquidation papers in his briefcase felt like a confession now. A confession that he'd become exactly what he'd always despised, Someone who measured human worth in quarterly reports. Someone who'd forgotten that businesses were made of people, not numbers. Tony grabbed Ryan's arm, his grip gentle but firm. "Come on, son. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Ryan didn't resist. Just let himself be pulled toward the door, his eyes down, his spirit broken. And Alexis Manz made a choice. Maybe the first real choice he'd made in 20 years. The first choice driven by something other than profit margins and return on investment. He stepped out of the shadows where he'd been standing and spoke in a voice that could cut through steel. "Let him go. Let him go." Alexis's voice cut through the room like a blade through butter. Clean. Absolute. Carrying the weight of 20 years of commanding boardrooms and making grown men nervous with a single sentence. The kind of voice that didn't request or suggest but stated reality and expected the world to adjust accordingly. Sullivan spun around so fast he nearly lost his balance, his face morphing from triumph to confusion to something approaching horror in the span of 3 seconds. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. "What? Who the hell are you? You can't just..." Alexis Manz. He stepped fully into the light, letting the pendant lamp illuminate his face, his expensive coat and shoes suddenly impossible to miss. "I own this building. I own this restaurant. I own everything in it, including the equipment you're threatening to have him arrested for using. And I'm telling you to take your hands off my employee. Right now." Tony dropped Ryan's arm like it had burned him, the security guard's face going from tan to white in an instant. He stepped back quickly, putting distance between himself and the situation, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Mr. Manz, I didn't know you were here. I was just following orders." "Following orders from someone who's about to be fired," Alexis said, his tone ice cold. He turned his gaze to Sullivan, and his expression could have frozen water. Marcus Sullivan. General manager with a 2-year track record of declining revenue, increasing staff complaints, and health code violations. "Tell me, Marcus, when exactly did I authorize you to have employees arrested for working overtime?" Sullivan's mouth opened and closed several times before words finally came out. He wasn't scheduled. He was using company resources without permission. He was trespassing. I thought. You thought wrong. Alexis moved closer to Sullivan, and despite being 3 inches shorter and not physically imposing, he somehow made the other man shrink. There was something in the way he carried himself, the way he looked at Sullivan, that communicated power and consequence without any need for volume or physical intimidation. "Let me tell you what I see," Alexis continued, his voice dropping to something quiet and dangerous. "Ryan Matthew has been working unpaid overtime for 6 months, developing a menu that might actually save this failing restaurant. A comprehensive menu with food science, sourcing plans, cost projections, and plating designs that would make most professional chefs jealous. While you were busy checking logs and playing security theater and inventing reasons to fire people, he was doing the job you should have been doing." "But the protocols," Sullivan tried weakly. "Protocols?" Alexis's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Let's talk about protocols, Marcus. Protocol says you close and secure the kitchen by midnight. You logged closure at 11:47 p.m., but when I arrived at 2:50 a.m., I found unlocked doors, unfinished prep work, and expired ingredients sitting out. Protocol says you document unusual activity and investigate before taking action. Ryan's been here at 3 a.m. for months, Marcus, and you never once thought to ask why, never thought to see what he was working on. Protocol says you develop your staff, identify talent, build a team that can execute at a high level. Instead, you've been running a kitchen with 47% turnover while burying the only real talent you had in night shifts where no one would notice him." Sullivan's face had gone from red to white, sweat beading on his forehead. I was just trying to protect the company's interests. By attacking its most valuable asset? Alexis shook his head. You're fired, Marcus. Effective immediately. Clean out your desk. Tony will escort you out. You have 20 minutes to collect your personal belongings, and if I ever hear that you've badmouthed this restaurant or Ryan Matthew or anyone else who works here to anyone in this industry, I will personally make sure every establishment in this city knows exactly why I let you go. Are we clear? Sullivan opened his mouth like he might argue, but something in Alexis's expression made him close it again. He looked at Ryan, then at Tony, then back at Alexis. Finally, he turned and stumbled toward the door, his shoulders slumped, his righteous anger deflated into humiliated defeat. Tony followed, carefully avoiding eye contact with everyone, his keys jangling as he hurried to escort Sullivan out of the building. The prep room fell silent except for the hum of the walk-in cooler and the distant sound of the door closing behind Sullivan and Tony. Alexis turned to Ryan, who stood frozen in place, his eyes wide with shock, his chest heaving like he'd just run a marathon. Are you all right? Ryan nodded slowly, but his hands were shaking visibly now that the adrenaline was fading. You're the owner. You actually own Ember and Oak. I do. Alexis bent down and picked up the notebook from where it had fallen during the confrontation, smoothing out a page that had gotten bent. And I think we need to talk about this menu of yours. Alexis pulled out a stool from the prep table and sat down, gesturing for Ryan to do the same. For a long moment, Ryan just stared at him like he was a ghost or a hallucination or maybe a trap. Like at any second this would be revealed as some kind of elaborate test and he'd still end up fired and arrested. Then, slowly, moving like every muscle hurt, he sank onto the stool across from Alexis. His chef's coat was still impossibly white despite everything that had just happened, despite 15 hours of work, despite the confrontation and the fear. Somehow he'd maintained his standards even in crisis. I don't understand, Ryan finally said, his voice rough from emotion and exhaustion. You're here at 3 a.m. You weren't on any schedule I've ever seen. Were you checking up on the restaurant? Testing us? I was here to finalize a liquidation. Alexis pulled the notebook between them, setting it down gently on the prep table. Tomorrow morning at 9, I'm supposed to meet with my lawyers to sign papers that close this place permanently. Sell the property, terminate all staff, walk away clean. That's what the numbers said I should do. That's what my CFO recommended. That's what my board of directors has been pushing me to do for 3 months. The color drained from Ryan's face, leaving him ashen. You're shutting us down. Closing Ember and Oak. I was, Alexis said, letting the past tense hang in the air like smoke. Until I found you here, working a 15-hour shift for $15 an hour, developing a menu that could revolutionize this restaurant while the person I was paying $180,000 a year to be head chef was taking credit for your work. Ryan's eyes snapped up, widening. How could you possibly know about the signature dishes that started getting rave reviews 6 months after you were hired? Alexis said calmly. The master chef I brought in 2 years ago, Chef Davis, with his James Beard nomination and his impressive resume. I've eaten his food at his previous restaurants. I've seen his technique in person. It was good, professional, but it wasn't this. He tapped the notebook. He didn't have the chemistry knowledge. Didn't have the creativity. Didn't have the obsessive attention to detail. But somehow, 6 months after a prep cook named Ryan Matthew was hired, our signature dishes suddenly started getting reviews that used words like transcendent and innovative and unlike anything else in the city. The timing isn't a coincidence, is it? Ryan's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping near his ear. But he didn't deny it. Chef Davis said he wanted to collaborate. Said he'd give me credit, maybe promote me to sous chef if things went well. He asked me to help develop some new recipes, said my ideas were interesting. But then the reviews came in, and suddenly everything was his creation, his vision, his genius. When I tried to say something, he told me if I opened my mouth, I'd be blacklisted. Said no one would ever believe a prep cook with no degree over a James Beard nominee with restaurants in 3 cities. He was right about one thing, Alexis said quietly. I wouldn't have believed it. I would have assumed he was the talent and you were, what? Lucky to have a job. Fortunate to learn from him. He shook his head. That's my failure. That's on me. Where did you learn to cook like this? Alexis asked, leaning forward. The truth. Not what's on your personnel file. Not what you tell people when you're trying to get hired. The real story. Ryan was quiet for a long moment, his hands folded on the prep table, his eyes distant. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw and vulnerable in a way that made Alexis understand he was hearing something true and painful. Chef Marcus Williams, Ryan began. He ran a small place in Northside, nothing fancy, just honest food served to people who appreciated it. Soul food fusion, he called it. Traditional techniques with modern presentations. I started washing dishes there when I was 16, lying about my age because I needed the money and he needed help. Worked after school, weekends, whenever I could. Ryan's voice got softer, like he was traveling back in time. He saw something in me, I guess. Maybe he was just lonely and wanted someone to teach. Maybe he recognized something about hunger, not for food but for knowledge, for purpose. He started keeping me after closing, teaching me knife skills while we cleaned up. Showed me how to make a proper roux. How to season by taste instead of measurement. How to understand that every ingredient has a story and a purpose. When I graduated high school, Ryan continued, he helped me apply for scholarships. Wrote recommendation letters. Made phone calls to people he knew. Got me a full ride to Johnson & Wales, one of the best culinary programs in the country. Said I had talent that shouldn't be wasted in dish pits. You went to Johnson & Wales? Alexis felt his eyebrows rise. That was top-tier culinary education. That changed everything about Ryan's resume. Why isn't that on your application? Because I didn't finish. Ryan's voice cracked slightly. I made it 2 years. Was pulling straight A's, loving every minute of it, learning technique and theory and food science. Then Chef Marcus had his heart attack. Massive coronary in the middle of dinner service. 1 minute he was calling out orders, moving between stations, doing what he loved. The next minute he was on the floor and nothing anyone did mattered. The air in the prep room felt too thick again. Alexis stayed quiet, letting Ryan tell his story. His family, Ryan's fingers traced the edge of the notebook automatically. His wife, Miss Patricia, had been working retail at Macy's for 30 years. Department store wages, barely enough to survive. His daughter, Keisha, was a sophomore at Ohio State, studying pre-med, trying to be the first person in their family to become a doctor. When he died, they had nothing. Hospital bills from the ambulance and the ER and the 3 days in ICU before he passed. Funeral costs. His daughter's tuition for spring semester was due. Insurance covered some of it, but not enough. Not nearly enough. Ryan looked down at his scarred hands. So I dropped out. Walked away from my scholarship, from my education, from everything Chef Marcus had fought to get for me. Came home. Got whatever job I could find. Started sending Miss Patricia money every month to help with bills, to keep Keisha in school. Worked nights because they paid a little more, not much, but enough to matter. Worked the shifts nobody else wanted because every extra dollar could help. And you kept learning, Alexis said quietly. I had to. Ryan's voice was fierce now, passionate. Chef Marcus spent years teaching me. Gave up his time, his knowledge, his patience. He believed in me when I was just some kid washing dishes. He saw something worth investing in. I couldn't let that die with him. So I kept studying on my own. Bought used textbooks. Watched videos. Practiced technique whenever I had access to a kitchen. Worked on recipes during night shifts when no one was watching. He gestured at the notebook. This menu, it's my way of honoring what he taught me. Of proving that his time wasn't wasted. Of showing that talent and dedication matter more than credentials or connections. I thought if I could create something good enough, something that brought people in and made them talk, it might save this restaurant. Might save everyone's jobs, including mine. Might prove that Chef Marcus was right about me. Ryan's voice broke on the last sentence, and he looked away, angry at himself for showing emotion again. Miss Patricia, Chef Marcus's wife, is she still working? Alexis asked gently. She retired last year. I helped her make the numbers work. Ryan wiped at his eyes quickly. And Keisha graduated in May. She's in medical school now at Case Western. I'm still helping with that because medical school is expensive as hell, but she's doing it. She's becoming the doctor her father always knew she could be. You gave up your future for theirs, Alexis said. No. Ryan shook his head firmly. I invested my present in honoring someone who invested in me. There's a difference. Chef Marcus used to say, we don't cook for ourselves. We cook for community. We cook because feeding people, really feeding them, not just filling their bellies, is one of the most human things we can do. He lived that. I'm just trying to do the same. Alexis sat back, looking at this young man who'd sacrificed everything for a mentor's family, who worked 15-hour days for poverty wages, who created genius in the shadows because he believed in craft and community more than recognition or reward. The liquidation papers in his briefcase felt like they were burning through the leather. Alexis stood up and walked to the small window in the prep room. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, that deep blue-purple that came just before dawn, that liminal space between night and day where the world held its breath. In a few hours, his lawyers would be waiting in their conference room with its view of the skyline and its coffee that cost $12 a cup. His CFO would be ready with printed copies of the liquidation papers, closure timelines, severance calculations. The board would review his decision and approve it and move on to the next asset, the next acquisition, the next number in the portfolio. He pulled out his phone, opened his email, and began typing. What are you doing? Ryan asked, his voice uncertain and exhausted. Canceling a meeting. Alexis hit send, watching the email disappear into the digital void. Then he opened another email, typing quickly. And firing my lawyers. Well, not firing them entirely, they're too good at what they do, but they're not going to like what I'm about to ask them to draft. His thumbs flew across the screen, years of corporate communication compressed into rapid-fire messages. I'm going to need new partnership agreements. Renovation budgets. A comprehensive marketing strategy for a complete rebrand. Hiring plans. Training protocols. Supply chain reorganization. I don't understand, Ryan said, his voice small. Alexis turned to face him, and for the first time in years, maybe decades, he felt something like excitement. Not the cold satisfaction of a successful acquisition or a profitable exit. Not the rush of closing a difficult deal or firing an underperforming executive. Real, genuine excitement about building something that mattered. About creating something that could change lives instead of just generating returns. The Phoenix menu, he said, tapping the notebook with one finger. You said it's about rising from the ashes. About taking something broken and making it better than it ever was. So let's do that. Let's burn this whole failed concept to the ground and rebuild from scratch. But this time, we do it right. Ryan's eyes went wide, confused and afraid and hopeful all at once. I don't, what are you saying? I'm saying that for the past 2 years, I've been trying to run this restaurant the way I run everything else in my portfolio. Like a spreadsheet. Like a problem to be optimized. I hired celebrity chefs who looked good on paper. I implemented efficiency protocols that killed creativity. I measured success in quarterly reports instead of in the quality of food or the satisfaction of customers or the growth of talented people. Alexis paused. And it failed. It failed because I forgot what actually makes a restaurant worth saving. He pulled out the stool again and sat down, leaning forward intently. You understand something I forgot, Ryan. You understand the soul of this work. You understand that it's not just about profit margins and return on investment. It's about community. It's about craft. It's about the fact that feeding people, really feeding them, body and soul, matters. You want to use my menu? Ryan asked, his voice barely audible. I want to partner with you. Alexis let that statement sit for a moment. Here's the reality, I know business. I know real estate, marketing, operations, how to scale a concept, how to manage finances, how to navigate the business side of hospitality. But I forgot somewhere along the way what actually makes a restaurant worth caring about. You know that. You understand it in your bones in a way I haven't for 20 years. He slid the notebook across the table. So here's my offer, and I want you to think about it carefully because this isn't charity and it's not a handout. We close Ember and Oak, the brand is damaged anyway, and we need a fresh start. We spend 3 months renovating, rebranding, building this menu properly from the ground up. During that time, you're head chef. Not prep cook. Not sous chef. Head chef with full creative control over the menu, the kitchen operations, the hiring and training of staff. Ryan's hands trembled as they touched the notebook. Why would you? I don't have the credentials. I don't have a degree. I'm 26 years old with burn scars and a resume that doesn't make sense. You have something better than credentials, Alexis said firmly. You have vision, skill, dedication, and a mentor who taught you that craft matters more than ego. That's worth more than any culinary school diploma. But the money, renovations, marketing, staff. Let me worry about the money, Alexis interrupted. That's my part of this partnership. I bring the business expertise and capital. You bring the creative vision and culinary execution. But here's the important part, this is a partnership, not employment. 20% equity stake in the business, with options to increase based on performance. You'll draw a salary, head chef rate, not prep cook wages, but you'll also own part of what we build. When this succeeds, you benefit. When we make decisions, we make them together. Ryan stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. I don't. I can't. This doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, Alexis said. At 3 a.m. this morning, I came here to sign a death certificate for a failed investment. Instead, I found the only thing worth keeping. The only person in this entire operation who genuinely cares about the craft and the community. You worked 15 hours for minimum wage. You gave up your education to honor your mentor's memory. You created a masterpiece in the shadows because you believed it mattered, even though no one was watching and no one would give you credit. He pulled the liquidation papers from his briefcase and held them up so Ryan could see them. Thick legal documents with tabs and signatures and all the corporate machinery of closing a business. Then, deliberately, maintaining eye contact, Alexis tore them in half. The sound was loud in the quiet prep room, final and irreversible. I built my career on a philosophy, efficiency or exit, Alexis continued, setting the torn papers on the table between them. But efficiency without humanity isn't success. It's just emptiness. It's measuring everything and valuing nothing. I'm tired of building things that don't matter. I'm tired of optimizing businesses into lifeless corporate shells. I want to build something real. Something that feeds people's souls, not just their bellies. Something that would make your chef Marcus proud. He extended his hand across the prep table, over the torn liquidation papers and the stained notebook and the scattered vegetables. So what do you say, Ryan? Want to build something that actually matters? Ryan stared at the outstretched hand. At the torn papers. At the notebook filled with 6 months of unpaid dreams and desperate hope. His eyes were wet, but when he spoke, his voice was steady. Chef Marcus would tell me I'm an idiot if I said no. Smart man, Alexis said. Ryan gripped his hand. The handshake was firm, sealed with calluses and burned scars and the kind of trust that could only be built at 3 a.m. when everyone else was sleeping and only the people who truly cared were still working. Outside, the sky continued to lighten, purple giving way to pink and orange, the promise of dawn breaking over the city. The digital clock still read 3 a.m. in red. Someone would have to fix that, add it to the list of things that needed attention. But inside the prep room, under that single pendant light, 2 men sat at a prep table covered in vegetables and notebooks and the scattered pieces of liquidation papers, planning not an ending but a beginning. All right, Alexis said, pulling out his phone to take notes. Walk me through this Phoenix menu. Every course, every technique, every story you want to tell. We've got 3 months to get this right, and I want to understand every detail. Ryan smiled, a real smile, not the careful, guarded expression he'd worn before. Not the defensive mask of someone expecting to be disappointed. A genuine smile of hope and possibility and the relief of finally being seen. He opened the notebook to the first page and began to talk, his voice growing stronger with each word, his hands gesturing as he described flavors and techniques and the kind of food that could make people stop and remember why they loved restaurants in the first place. First course is called The Awakening, Ryan said, his finger tracing the notes he'd written. It's about that moment when you take the first bite of something unexpected and your whole perception shifts. I start with a compressed watermelon. You use a chamber vacuum to intensify the flavor and change the texture, paired with a smoked salt that Chef Marcus taught me to make. The salt has this subtle heat that builds slowly, and there's a mint lime granita that cuts through everything at the end. It's sweet, savory, hot, and cold all at once. Alexis typed notes on his phone, captured by the passion in Ryan's voice. What's the story you're telling? That food doesn't have to be what you expect. That the best experiences come from being open to surprise. That simple ingredients, treated with respect and creativity, can be transcendent. Ryan flipped to the next page. Second course is. And he kept talking, describing each dish with the kind of detail that came from months of thinking and planning and dreaming. Alexis asked questions, offered business perspective on sourcing and pricing, suggested presentation ideas based on his decades in the industry. They talked about staffing needs, training protocols, how to build a kitchen culture that valued creativity and growth. Somewhere in the margins of that notebook, in handwriting that only Ryan would recognize, there was a note that Chef Marcus had written years ago, back when Ryan was just a kid washing dishes and dreaming of something more. The best menus are written at midnight, when the world is quiet enough to hear what the ingredients are trying to tell you. But the best partnerships are forged at dawn, when 2 people decide to build something together that neither could create alone. The clock outside finally clicked forward. 3:01 a.m. Time started moving again. But nothing would ever be the same. 3 months later, the Phoenix would open its doors to a line of customers that stretched around the block. Food critics would use words like revolutionary and transcendent and the future of dining. Ryan Matthew would be profiled in Food and Wine magazine as one of the industry's most exciting young chefs. Keisha Williams would finish her first year of medical school, funded by the scholarship program Ryan and Alexis established in Chef Marcus's name. But all of that was still to come. For now, there were just two men in a prep room at dawn, planning a menu that would change both their lives, bound together by the understanding that real talent doesn't need a pedigree, it just needs to be seen. If this story moved you, show some love. Like this video to tell the algorithm more people need to see this. Subscribe and turn on notifications for more inspiring stories about hidden talent and second chances. Comment below, how many Ryan Matthews are invisible in your workplace right now? Share this with someone who's been the 3 a.m. worker, grinding in silence, waiting to be seen. Your engagement helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. Thank you for being here.